we're beginning our fourth session of Eurasian online seminar, and we're delighted to have Professor Joseph Nye with us, whom everyone knows, but I'm still going for the record to introduce him. The seminar is organized by the Department of International Relations and in collaboration with International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism of High School of Economics, University here in Moscow. And our speaker today is Professor Joseph Nye, one of the greatest living authorities in the field of international relations. And our students study your works quite a lot. So Joseph Nye is a University Distinguished Service Professor and former Dean of Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He received his bachelor degree from Princeton University, studied at Oxford University on a Rhodes Scholarship, and earned a PhD in political science from Harvard University, where he joined the faculty in 1964. I was just thinking that I was only born in 61. So in 2008, a poll of 2,700 international relations scholars listed him as the most influential scholar on American foreign policy. And in 2011, Foreign Policy listed him among 100 leading global thinkers. From 77 to 79, Professor Nye was a Deputy Undersecretary of State and chaired the National Security Council Group on non-proliferation of nuclear weapons. In 93-94, he chaired the National Intelligence Council, which prepares intelligence estimates for the president, and in 94-95 served as Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security Affairs. Professor Nye has published 14 academic books, a novel, which is, I think, even more important, and more than 200 articles in professional and policy journals. His recent books include Soft Power, The Powers to Lead, The Future of Power, Is the American Century Over? And the book he's going to talk about today, Do Morals Matter? Presidents and Foreign Policy from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Trump. Professor Nye is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the British Academy, the American Academy of Diplomacy, and honorary fellow of Exeter College, which is part of Oxford University. He is the recipient of Princeton University's Woodrow Wilson Award, the Charles Merriam Award from American Political Science Association, Francis Palm Academic, Japan's Order of the Rising Sun, and various honorary degrees. Professor Nye has made a significant contribution to international relations theory. He is the co-founder, along with Robert Keohane, of the international relations theory of neoliberalism, developed in their 1977 book, Power and Interdependence. Together, they developed the concepts of asymmetrical and complex interdependence. They also explored transnational relations and world politics in an edited volume in the 1970s. In the late 1980s, he coined the term soft power, which everyone studies now. And it first came into widespread usage following a piece Professor Nye wrote in Foreign Policy in 1990. More recently, his notion of smart power became very popular among both experts and politicians. So today I understand he's going to discuss his book and the problem of morals in politics and discuss how morals work with US presidents. Well, we're a free country here in Russia, and we are very free to discuss morals of presidents, especially US presidents. So you are welcome. And Professor Nye said that he's going to talk not for a long time, about 20, 30 minutes, and because he likes questions. So please prepare your questions, and please write your names and that indicate that you want to ask a question into the chat, because in that case, I know the exact order of them. Well, thank you very much, Professor Nye. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Alexander. It's a pleasure to be back in Moscow, even if it's only virtual. I spent many happy times visiting in Moscow and made many, many good Russian friends, some of whom I see today. And so it's a pleasure to be back there. I just wish it were physically possible, but we'll have to deal with that another time. People ask me, why did you write a book with the title, Do Morals Matter? Indeed, one of my friends, when I told her I was writing a book with that title, said, well, at least it'll be a very short book. Because the conventional wisdom that if MacArthur was allowed to drop 20 to 25 to 40 atomic bombs on Chinese cities, he could win the war. Truman said no, that in fact, he was not going to kill that many women and children. And that was a tremendously important decision. As my former colleague Thomas Schelling, the Nobel laureate economist, put it in his Nobel lecture, the nuclear taboo, which is that we treat nuclear weapons as weapons for deterrence rather than normal warfighting weapons, has been one of the most important things that has occurred since 1945. Imagine that if Truman had not made that moral decision, look how different the world would be today if nuclear weapons were normal warfighting weapons rather than weapons for deterrence. So I would submit that that's an example of a president whose moral views led to a decision which had extremely important consequences, both for American foreign policy, but also for the nature of world politics. Well, there are other examples, but I'm not going to go into them because of the problems of time. But let me then turn to this question, if morals matter, which I try to demonstrate with these histories of the 14 presidents, how should we think about it? And Americans have a tremendous tendency, it's sometimes called American exceptionalism, to think that because the Americans do it, that it's moral. That, of course, is a non sequitur. Just ask a Mexican or a Philippine whether American foreign policy in the 19th century was moral or not. Of course not. So this usual view that's common that Americans have good intentions, therefore, if we did it, it's moral, is a very shallow way of thinking about international morality or politics. Similarly, sometimes you'll have American leaders who will say, well, his intentions were good, therefore he had moral clarity. For example, Ari Fleischer, who was the press secretary for George W. Bush, said that Bush had to be praised for his moral clarity of his freedom agenda and his democracy promotion. My argument is that that, again, is very shallow thinking, and that instead of that, we have to think in three dimensions when we assess the morality of international actions. And those three are the intentions or motives, the means that are chosen, and the consequences. Let me give you an example from by citing a case of a car accident. Suppose that your daughter is out at a school dance, but she has examinations the next morning, and a friend offers to bring her home from the school dance early. He'll make sure he gets her home early so that she's well rested for the examinations. He picks her up. He doesn't notice that the road has become wet or icy. He's speeding to get her home fast. He slides off the road, hits a tree, and your daughter is killed. You wouldn't say, well, that's okay because his intentions were good. Of course not. You'd say he did not pay due diligence to the means that were used. He chose inappropriate means, and he didn't spend enough attention on the question of immoral unintended consequences and protect against those. And the net result is the action as a whole was immoral. In law, we would call that culpable negligence. I would argue you can draw that same analogy for George W. Bush's actions in Iraq. Some people say that Bush's intentions were bad. Let me grant him good intentions. Let's suppose that it really was to get rid of Saddam Hussein and to try to democratize the Middle East as a way to remove the roots of terrorism, which is what Bush said. The question still remains, even if those intentions were good, he didn't pay adequate attention to the means and choose good means. For example, the US State Department and intelligence communities had prepared a number of papers showing the difficulties of occupying Iraq and of trying to democratize Iraq. These were swept aside. And then when he eventually occupied Iraq, it was not very difficult to defeat Saddam Hussein, but to suppress the insurgency and to democratize the country was beyond his capacity. So what he did, in fact, was to not to weaken, but to strengthen al-Qaeda in Iraq, which eventually transposed into the Islamic State. And as we know, the consequences of this were horrible, a lot like the car accident example that I gave you. So that's a case in which you have to judge Bush's actions or any international action on three dimensions: his motives, his means, and his consequences. And I would argue when you balance those three dimensions, you would say this was a moral failure. So that would be the gist of the argument about how we should think about judging moral issues in international politics. But obviously, it's quite complex, more so than my simple analogy of the car accident. For example, when you look at motives, you notice that sometimes the stated intentions of a president are different from what really drives him. For example, in the case of Vietnam, both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson said that their intention was to preserve South Vietnam from domination by the communist regime in North Vietnam. But what's interesting is that for Kennedy, he was probably not willing to escalate the way Johnson did. McGeorge Bundy, who was Kennedy's advisor and national security advisor and Johnson's national security advisor, said near the end of his life that he thought that had Kennedy been reelected rather than been assassinated, he would have pulled out of Vietnam. Johnson, of course, made the opposite decision and sent 565,000 American troops into Vietnam. And when Bundy was asked, what's the difference? Why did one act differently than the other, since their stated intention in both cases was to preserve Saigon from communist domination? Bundy said that the motives were different in the sense that Kennedy did not want to be seen as foolish or not smart. But Johnson, who'd grown up in Texas with a culture where he was very conflicted about how you were seen, whether you were strong and macho or whether you were seen as a coward. Johnson feared most of all being a coward or being seen as a coward. And that led him to persist in this mistaken policy, even at times when he knew that he was losing. So motives and intentions are affected not just by the stated intentions, but also by the personal needs of the president. And we sometimes call this their emotional IQ, their ability to master their emotions to make sure that they don't distort their stated or formal intentions. Kennedy had a good deal more emotional IQ than Johnson had. Let me turn then to the question of means. When you look at means, sometimes people will say, yes, but sometimes presidents have to use bad means. That's just in the nature of the job. And lying is an example that's frequently cited. All the presidents basically lie. Indeed, I would say all human beings lie. A little bit of introspection will tell us that. The question is, what type of lie and how many lies? For example, Franklin Roosevelt in 1941 lied to the American people about a supposed attack by a German U-boat on an American destroyer. Roosevelt said the Germans attacked first. The fact was the Americans attacked first. But Roosevelt justified this on the grounds that he was trying to awaken the American people to the threat that was posed by Hitler. And therefore, the lie was not a self-regarding lie, but an other-regarding lie, if for the benefit of these people. Now, those lies sometimes shade off into different positions that are harder to defend. Lyndon Johnson made a similar calculation when he lied about the American boats being attacked in the Gulf of Tonkin, which led to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. So even other regarding lies may be too costly to justify. But there's also the question of what about the amount of lying? And there, if you look at somebody like Donald Trump, the Washington Post has a fact-checking department, and their fact-checking department calculated that Donald Trump told something like 15,000 lies in the first 1,000 days of his presidency. The trouble with that is it debases the currency. It basically destroys trust. Nobody trusts you or trusts your country if you lie to that extent. And you can see that if you look at the American soft power, the reputation which leads to attraction, there's a considerable decline in American soft power as measured by public opinion polls in the period since Trump has become president. So lies may be justified in some circumstances. So you can imagine presidents using means that are far from perfect, but it matters what's the nature of the lie and how much of it there is. Finally, let me turn to the question of consequences. There are always unintended consequences which are difficult to predict when you're dealing with complex social situations such as you find in foreign policy. And knowing or estimating those consequences accurately is extremely important. Sometimes a leader will do a worst case assumption as a way to justify actions which are merely convenient in his assessment of consequences. For example, many people will say that when survival is at stake, when it's the fate of the nation, so to speak, then you have to think of those consequences, survival, and not worry too much about morality. And an example that's sometimes cited is that in 1940, after Hitler took over France and controlled Vichy France, Churchill was worried that if Hitler gained control of the French fleet, This would mean Britain would no longer be able to protect itself as an island. The Royal Navy would no longer be strong enough. And so what he did is he bombed his ally, the French fleet, and killed 1,300 French sailors. Now, you could say that was an extraordinary immoral thing to do. Churchill's justification was that if it was a matter of national survival, I had very little choice. And therefore, I did an act which, under normal circumstances, would be immoral, but the consequences of not acting were even more immoral, which would be the destruction of the British nation and Hitler's control of Britain. So you can appeal to extreme cases like that, but the reality is that most of international politics is not about those types of extreme cases. There are many issues which relate to values, which are not matters of survival. So, for example, when in the case of the murder of the Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Trump's reaction was, well, it's a tough world out there, just get over it. But even the conservative Wall Street Journal criticized Trump for that, saying that in a sense, he was treating the situation as though it were analogous to the survival of the fleet in 1940, and it's not. Here's a case where, according to the journal, Trump could have criticized the actions as a way of preserving values. That there are certain standards which the Saudis had violated, which should not be glossed over. So to treat every situation as though it's like the French fleet in 1940 is the cheap way out in terms of judging consequences. Good assessment of consequences requires what I call situational IQ, the ability to appraise a situation so that you have a proper assessment of the consequences. Now, nobody can know for certain. Mistakes are always possible. But if you go back to my example of Bush and Iraq, he did not do a proper assessment of the potential consequences. And therefore, you could argue that the action was not a moral action and was culpable. So to wrap this up, to stay within my promised limit so that we can have more time to have discussion, what I do in the book is I look at the 14 presidents and assess them on all three dimensions of morals, means, intentions, means, and consequences, and then do a little scorecard for each one. And I assign them then into three categories: the 4 top presidents, the 4 bottom presidents, and the rest who are stretched out in between. The ones that I rate at the top or near the top are Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and George H.W. Bush, the first President Bush. And I do that because they had a way of defining American national interest broadly rather than narrowly. They saw an interest which could be good for the US, but good for others at the same time, by creating institutional frameworks which could allow the pursuit of global public goods. And I think they also showed considerable emotional intelligence. I mentioned Truman's deciding to accept defeat in Korea rather than drop 25 atomic bombs on China. I mentioned, or I should mention, the fact that Eisenhower, at one point, though he talked a lot about nuclear deterrence, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff came to him with a proposal for preemptive war against the Soviet Union, the argument was that the Soviet Union was about to have a considerable nuclear capacity, and it was important to attack well, we were ahead before the Soviets had that capacity. Eisenhower's comment to them is, you boys must be crazy. Said, suppose you do destroy everything all the way to Vladivostok, then what do you do with that? What have you done to that huge part of humanity? And he said, no. And his motives were not just practical motives, they were including moral motives, that he defined the national interest to include that broader dimension. And George H.W. Bush, example would be in 1989, after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, when he was being criticized by many of his conservative supporters, including the writer for the New York Times, saying that he should make more of a celebration of the decline of or the collapse of the wall. This was a great victory in the Cold War. And Bush's comment was, I'm not going to dance on the wall. I have to negotiate with Gorbachev in a very difficult period, and my gloating over the collapse of the wall will make that type of negotiation more difficult. Those are examples to me of basic emotional intelligence and the ability to define a national interest broadly and not in narrow transactional terms. My bottom four presidents are basically Lyndon Johnson for the mistakes he made in getting us into Vietnam, Richard Nixon for the fact that he decided to sacrifice or charge the lives of 22,000 more young Americans and countless Vietnamese for what he called a decent interval between the time in which America left South Vietnam and Hanoi took over. And the third person I would put in this bottom quartile was George W. Bush for his actions on Iraq, though I do give him credit for some of the other actions he took, like taking initiatives on the president's efforts to stem pandemics in Africa. And then I put Donald Trump in this bottom quartile for his very narrow transactional definitions of American interests rather than seeing it more broadly. And the rest of the presidents are stretched out in between. Just to give you an illustration to tie this into, as I conclude, to the current crisis, the COVID crisis, I argue that we've seen appalling leadership in both the United States and China in reactions to this new pandemic. If you look at both Xi Jinping and Donald Trump, their first reaction was denial. And that denial delayed responses, which cost thousands of lives. After denial, they turned to blame shifting. A Chinese foreign ministry spokesman blamed the presence of the virus in Wuhan on the American military. Donald Trump then started talking about the China virus. There was no effort to get out of their zero-sum context and define a broader national interest. In that sense, it's a pity because there was an opportunity here to do something different. We missed a chance because we had a very narrow, self-interested leader rather than a leader who took a broader perspective. For example, if you think of the problems of the COVID virus, we know that in 1918, when the influenza epidemic killed more people than died in all of World War I, that it came in waves, and that the second wave in the fall of 1918 was actually more lethal than the first wave. We should probably expect something like that in the area of this coronavirus. And if you find out that poor countries in the southern half of the globe are less able to cope with the COVID virus, they will become reservoirs for this virus, which will then sweep back up into the northern half of the globe on a seasonal basis. And that will be bad for us as well as bad for them. Imagine that Trump had taken a position in which he said, viruses don't care about the nationality of the humans they kill. This is a new type of transnational threat. We can only solve it by thinking of power with others, not just power over others. And I appeal to China, Russia, Europe, Japan, and other richer countries to join at a group at the G20 or an emergency Security Council session and create a COVID resilience fund, a massive fund to help poor countries, open to all countries. And that will be done because it's in our interest as well as a humanitarian interest. So we can do both at the same time. And I appeal then that in the case of this new challenge, this new transnational challenge, that we start thinking of power with others to deal with this threat rather than just our usual power over others. And in that framework, we can begin to transform the way morals can play a role in world politics. Alas, that was not the nature of the leadership in either China or in the United States or elsewhere. Though Kevin Rudd, the former Prime Minister of Australia, has suggested that what he calls an M7 of middle-level countries might try something like this. But I'm afraid, rather than that, what we've seen is that we've lost the opportunity to have transformational leadership. And instead, our transactional leadership means that the future or the effects of the COVID crisis are going to be a continuation of what people call pre-existing conditions, which will be greater populism in rich countries, more narrow technological use of authoritarian methods in other countries, and this opportunity will have been missed. So my argument to sum up is that, yes, there are times in the past when morals have mattered, and I've given a couple of examples and tried to give a number more in the book, where if a president had taken a different decision, the world could have turned out a lot worse or a lot better. And I then conclude with this decision saying, and a major opportunity has been missed in the last few months. And alas, I fear that we're not going to recover that. But I'd love to hear the views and opposite views from others as well. So that's why I want to stop here and get to the questions. So thank you very much for listening.
Just a second, please. I will turn the microphone on for Professor Lukin.
Okay, thank you very much. Sorry that we had some technical problem because we have never had so many people, so we couldn't control everyone. But now I think it's solved. Right, so I have a lot of questions here, mainly from students. Let me ask a question first then, to use my administrative position. Well, it's interesting to listen about morality and politicians, but when you talk about morality, do you talk about morality from their point of view, or from, because morality is not an objective thing, or maybe you think it is, I'm not sure, but what is moral for Trump maybe is not moral for you necessarily. So he may think that he is doing a moral thing, but everyone else does not believe him. And so what what do we do with that? I mean, or shall we find the unified morality or something?
No, I don't think you can get a single unified morality. What I mean, behavioral psychologists have shown is that independent of culture, that there are impulses in our species toward moral action. And that's why we've survived as a species which is able to cooperate where, let's say, bears or elk or giraffes can't build bridges or send people to the moon. But the problem is that in different cultures, this moral impulse, which is hardwired into us, is interpreted in different ways. So one has to realize that there's going to be relativity. There are some moral positions which cut across cultures, but there are many that are different. But even within a given culture, you have quite wide ranges of views. So I'm not arguing that there is one universal interpretation of morality. I think what's interesting about Trump is he's the most amoral president we've had. I was referring to presidents in relation to the people who elected them, the people they lead, which would basically be Americans in this case, and was arguing that a good president interprets not just the moral views of Americans, but tries to extend it to a broader community internationally as well at the same time. Trump doesn't do that. He basically mobilizes the views of a subset of Americans, plays upon existing divisions and hostilities to keep his base mobilized. And unlike, let's say, a leader like, let's say, Nelson Mandela at the end of apartheid in South Africa, who could have just appealed to Black South Africans as his constituency, on the contrary, did the opposite. He tried to broaden the identity of his followers to see them and other races, Indians and whites, as part of a larger South Africa. That's not Trump. Trump appeals to his own personal interests, and he mobilizes divisions in the public to suit him. So my interest in writing the book is to look at how different presidents did interpret the morality of the people that they led and who elected them. And this is why I divided it into the categories of the four who I thought were best and the four I thought were worst.
Oh, thank you very much. I wonder if Professor Karaganov wants to make a comment or say something.
Thank you. I raised my hand, so I wanted to thank you very much.
Yeah.
First of all, I mean, thank you, Joseph. I mean, it has been a very convincing case, very elegantly done. And I would agree with almost everything, but if I were an American, because you judge them as an American, and I think you're quite right. The problem is that Alexander Lukin, Professor Lukin, has already mentioned that is that people look at this world, I mean, and from different angles. Lenin and Trotsky were, in many ways, highly moral men. They wanted to make, in their own, they wanted to make the humanity free from capitalism and oppression. That ended up, as we know, even Hitler wanted to make his nation happy and to overcome humiliation. So while your argument is pertinent and I think right for judgment, your politicians within one country, I think it's still morality is irrelevant for international relations. Apart from the obvious things that we should work together to save the world, but that is it's not morality; it's interest. We have to work together to do away with this virus, or we had to work together before to prevent that. But that is not about morality. It is moral, of course, but it's not about morality. It's about interest. And I must say that when we were in a direct confrontation with you 30 or 40 years ago, I was arguing against the elimination of nuclear weapons, and because of a very simple reason. Not only because I was afraid that we wouldn't deter you, but I was afraid that you wouldn't deter us, Soviets. No. So it is better to count on the interests than on morale, because morale is geographically bound, and of course, morale, and of course, it is highly dependent, as you say, on the culture. So that is my reaction. So for your country, your analysis is great. For international relations, I'm not sure. But I have another question too, if you have time, maybe later. Now you are together with Cohen, Gilpin, Ramon Vernon. I mean, they're godfathers, intellectual godfathers of globalization, liberal globalization. Now it is in retreat. And you were saying, and I believed at that time in what you said, that over years the state would be overcome, transnational corporations and international NGOs will run the world. Now they are relegated to, service positions. When and if a new wave of globalization comes, will it, after what kind of a period? We have had, of course, globalization before, then it collapsed. Now it seems collapsing again. So what is your prediction for the faraway future? Clearly not for the next 30 years, because we will live in turmoil.
Well, both good questions, Sergey. Let me be brief in my replies. I'm not arguing you shouldn't start with interests. You should start with interests. What I'm saying is where the morals come in is how do you define the interests? So, for example, Trump says America first. I would think Macron should say France first. That's normal. The question is, do you find your interests narrowly, just I win, you lose, or do you define it in a way where others can win as well, or at least you don't do damage to their interests? And that's why I cited cases like Harry Truman's case. He defined the interest not just for himself, but in a broad sense. And same with George H.W. Bush. So the moral element comes in not in ignoring interests. The moral element comes in of how do you define the interests. On the second question about globalization, I think we're going to see a setback of economic globalization as a result of this coronavirus, but some of it was already, there was a movement for decoupling between Washington and China even before the coronavirus. I don't think it's going to be a collapse of economic globalization, but I think it will be set back. But when we think about globalization, which we define as interdependence at continental scale, we have to realize that there are good and bad globalization. Maybe economic globalization, like trade, should be seen in the good category. Pandemics and climate change should be seen in a bad category. And these are driven by the technologies of communication, transportation, and so forth. They're not going away, they're going to increase. And the only way you can cope with them, essentially, is to work with others. So the view that somehow globalization is ending, ironically, maybe we should think good globalization is going to diminish, bad globalization is going to increase, and the only way we're going to deal with it is if we learn to cooperate.
Well, thank you very much. The next question is from Olga Puzanova, who is a researcher at our laboratory and an expert on Japan. Go ahead.
Hello, Professor Nye, thank you so much for your wonderful insights. It's lovely to meet you, even though the circumstances are slightly odd. I'm sorry to shift the focus from higher matters, what Professor Karaganov was asking, to even more theoretical things, but I wanted to ask a question that isn't specifically related to US policy as such, although it is very interesting to hear how you evaluate and compare decision-making processes of various US presidents, especially calling Trump immoral. So this isn't really a new tendency, but it's especially popular now to conduct interdisciplinary studies. And I couldn't really help but noticing that in your talk, you did so as well to an extent by using phrases like emotional intelligence, IQ in the international context, blame shifting, pre-existing conditions. Obviously, morality in itself is a strange category as well. And I recently came across this new theory, well, relatively new theory in IR, which is, I'm sure many of you have heard of. It's called neoliberalism. So neoliberal principles coped with, derived from the insights in behavioral sciences. And would you say this applies to your approach in any way? And if so, is there potential for developing IR theory in this direction? Thank you so much.
Well, it's an interesting question, and I've always felt that we should not worry too much about labels. I mean, Alexander mentioned in introducing me that Cohen and I are attributed to developing neoliberalism as a theory. I call myself a liberal realist. I mean, because there's some truth in realism, there's some value in liberalism, and the combination is the most interesting. As for disciplines, I find that some of the most interesting work comes at the peripheries of disciplines. It's where disciplines intersect with each other. And that leads you to see change, which you otherwise wouldn't see. So I would argue that introducing concepts from other fields and looking at the, if you want, the borders or boundaries of the traditional field is the area for young scholars to explore the most interesting things. Even for an old man like me, I've been spending some time trying to understand cyber. My granddaughters are much better on the iPhone than I am, but I can at least tell the cyber people a little bit about how this new technology interacts with traditional international politics. So I've published in refereed journals on cyber, which means I had to learn a little bit about it. I don't pretend I'll ever be an expert on it, but it's that intersection between the old theories and the new domain, which is the area which is most exciting. I suspect the same will be true, and we'll see increasing attention now to biological sciences and medicine, not only in areas like pandemics that we're suffering right now, but on the whole new domain of what do you do about the human genome, CRISPR, engineering new human beings? Should that be, should there be regulation of that? If so, how would you do it? So I would urge you as a young scholar, keep your mind open to a lot of adjoining peripheral fields, because that may be where the most interesting new ideas will come from.
Well, we have a number of questions. Oh, let's first go to Professor Suslov, because Professor Suslov is our probably best expert on the United States.
Not really, Alexander Vladimirovich, but hello, Dr. Nye. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. You are doing a great effort indeed, because the problem of morale is one of the eternal problems of international relations. I think Thucydides was one of the first to talk about and conceptualize these issues. Some problems have already been identified by my colleagues and yourself, that there is no universal morale in international affairs, and I can identify a clear example when not just interests clash, but also the understandings of morale clash in recent history and produced quite intense conflicts in Russia-West relations. This is NATO war against Yugoslavia. It was justified by the West from the moral viewpoint, but from the Russian viewpoint, it was not just a violation of the international law, but it was an act of immorality, right? Of grave immorality, and this understanding was very sincere, and we all know the consequences, right? On the other hand, from the Russian perspective, taking Crimea is moral, even if it violates some principles of the international law. So there is no solution in this regard. However, my question actually goes to a topic which is a little bit different, but only a little bit, but very close also to you, the future of American leadership and the future of the American role in the world beyond Donald Trump. We all know that you are quite close to the Democratic Party. You had good relations with Hillary Clinton. Now Joseph Biden is the major Democratic candidate in the US elections, and his foreign policy campaign, as we'll see from his recent article in Foreign Affairs, claims that we need to turn over the page of Donald Trump, and then the American leadership will be restored with the new focus on multilateralism, respectful relations with allies, climate change topic, and so on and so forth. And thus there is this, on the one hand, idea of restoration of American leadership in its pre-existing form after Trump, and Trump is a temporary or aberration from this regard. However, there is another thinking which claims that no, there are systemic factors in the world that will prevent just a restoration of the previous type of American leadership, the rise of China, the new confrontation, emergence of multipolarity, and so on and so forth. There are powerful internal trends in American domestic politics that favor egoism, that favor mercantilism. By the way, even Joseph Biden doesn't use the term free trade, but uses the term fair trade, which is a Trumpism. So in your opinion, what will be the future of American role and leadership in the world? Will we see a further kind of movement of the United States from the position of the global leader to a position of major great power, actually, but one among many? Or you still think, as Joseph Biden tries to claim, that after Trump there will be just an automatic restoration of the Obama's type of American position in the world? Thank you very much.
Well, good question, Professor Suslov. I basically want to distinguish between the type of statements that a politician makes in a campaign and an analysis. I think the idea of returning to previous American position is ridiculous. It's not going to happen. I think the people around Biden who really advise him most closely understand that as well. But there's a difference between what you say when you're trying to win voters and then what you do when you formulate a policy. I wrote a book a couple of years ago called "Is the American Century Over?" And in that book, I said, it's not over in the sense that China is going to replace the United States, but it is over in the sense that the United States is not going back to the type of dominance that it had after World War II. And even then, remember that the Soviet Union balanced American power. So the liberal international order was not a global order. It did not include the Soviet Union, did not include China, did not include India. So more than half of the world was outside of it. So the argument that we go back to the earlier world is, I think, not realistic. What I do think is that the proposition that the largest country either helps to take the lead in providing public goods, global public goods, or nobody does. Everybody else becomes a free rider. And I think the United States is likely to remain the largest country, both economically and militarily, for another couple of decades. I don't know how far one looks into the future. But China is obviously now about 60% of the size of the American economy. What that means is the Americans are going to need to think about organizing international cooperation, but they're going to have to share it with others. Also, Europe, when it acts as an entity, is an economy the size of the American economy. So we're not going to be back to a situation where you have restoration of the old regime, but you are still going to be in a situation where, as the largest country, the Americans are going to have to work with others to organize cooperation. So if you take something like the current health problem, or you take something like the dangers of climate change, which I think are very real, the Americans can't do this alone, but nobody else can. And if the Americans and the Chinese don't play a role, since the two of them are responsible for 40% of greenhouse gases, it isn't going to get done. So again, the important thing is not a restoration of the past, but a realization that the Americans are likely to remain the largest for another couple of decades, and with that goes a responsibility.
Well, thank you very much. We have a lot of questions, actually, so I'll have to group them because some of them are similar. And we have two groups of questions at the moment. Well, one group is about soft power, but not exactly, not soft power in general. It's interesting that a lot of students, from what I can see, ask this question, like if a non-democratic power, non-Western power can have soft power. Some people ask about China, some people ask about the BRICS group, or somebody even asked if a totalitarian country can have a soft power. So this is one group. And another group is about the future, like post-COVID world. Is it going to be like Western dominated or post-Western or China dominated? You know, that kind of thing. Yes, so if you could answer both.
Well, on the first question about soft power, anybody can have soft power. It doesn't have to be Western or Western values. Soft power is the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment. So Osama bin Laden had soft power. He didn't pay the people who flew the planes into the tower. He didn't hold a gun to their head and threaten them. He attracted them by a very perverse version of his religion. But it was soft power that got them to follow him, not payment or coercion. The point about soft power is it all depends on the eye of the beholder. So what produces soft power in one audience may not produce soft power in another audience. So, for example, it could well be that China's authoritarian tendencies, let's say locking up people in Xinjiang, may actually be attractive in Zimbabwe, but not attractive in Sweden. So it may produce soft power in one setting and not another. Similarly, American Hollywood movies, which show women running around in bikinis and divorcing their husbands, may attract people in, let's say, some parts of Europe, but may be repulsive in Saudi Arabia. So what produces soft power for one audience doesn't produce it for another. So yes, non-Western countries or groups can definitely have soft power. Then one has to get into the question of what are the most likely audiences? What are the actions that are most likely to produce an audience which is attracted? And then you can say, well, the bin Laden ideology had an appeal, but it was a limited appeal, and certainly didn't have a broad appeal globally. So one has to admit, if soft power is power, it's the ability to get what you want through attraction rather than coercion or payment, then anybody can have it if they are able to mobilize it to attract an audience to do what you want. So soft power, sometimes people think that I wrote soft power to say that it was just American or it was about, and that's not the case. As an analytical concept, it's more neutral. I would add to that the argument that I think that democratic ideology and liberal institutions, freedom of the press and so forth, probably attract more people than authoritarian ones do, but that's an empirical question, not one to be decided in the definition. On the second question, what will a post-COVID world look like? The answer to that, of course, is nobody knows. We're in Act One of a long play. Now, it's true, I think, that Chekhov said that if there's a gun on the wall in Act One of the play, you know it will be fired by Act Three. But frankly, at this stage, we don't even know whether the play will have 3 acts or more. So to try to predict what a post-COVID world will look like at this stage is very rash. But one could imagine a number of different scenarios. I don't think, however, that it's going to have a big effect on power transition. And I wrote a piece in the journal Foreign Policy about a week or so ago, saying that I did not think that this was going to be the turning point where China took over from the United States, for example. I fear that what we're going to see in a post-COVID world is simply an accentuation of trends that were already there, which is ones that have already been mentioned of populism and nationalism in richer countries and more use of technology for authoritarian purposes in poorer countries. But frankly, at this stage, these are guesses. So the article I wrote in Foreign Policy about what things will look like after a post-COVID world was simply to knock down the view that this was a geopolitical turning point, which was suddenly going to lead to Chinese dominance. I don't see that at all. But the actual shape of what the world will look like is very hard to predict. For one thing, we're likely to see a prolonged recession, and we know that that has major political effects as well as economic effects. And we're also likely to see a new attention to biological issues, and some of those biological issues will be against a common enemy, like a virus. Others might be the introduction of biological terrorism, or biological warfare may return. So I don't know the answer, but I think we should be wary of predictions that this is a geopolitical turning point where China is going to prevail.
Well, thank you very much. Akop Gabrielian wanted to ask, wrote several times. Where are you, Akop?
Yes, I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. And first of all, before I start, I would like to wish you, Professor Nye, and all American people a strong health. I believe this is a time when only joint effort may help us overcome this crisis. So as a person who actually has already covered your book, I have 2 questions. In the second paragraph, you particularly write that in foreign policy, it is similar to medicine. We should follow the Hippocratic oath, that is, first not to harm. I would like to know your opinion, whether the Russian leaders, the United States leaders, and the Chinese leaders follow this oath. And the second question is also very precise. It is related to the very recent article that you wrote in Foreign Policy, that is the role of international organizations. So what is your opinion about the changing impact of the United Nations? Because this organization is under a huge criticism right now and might still be under criticism after we overcome COVID crisis. Thank you very much for your kind answers.
Well, interesting questions on the leaders. One would wish that you had an emergency session of the Security Council, which Putin and Xi and Trump and Macron and Merkel and so forth would all attend. Or in addition to that, an emergency summit of the G20, and try to get the leaders to raise their sights away from the competitive blame shifting. I mean, what the Chinese did after they made a failure in the early stages of their COVID response was to try to change the narrative by what some have called face mask diplomacy and by propaganda. And Trump has basically done more or less the same thing. This gets us nowhere. I mean, it gets the world nowhere because its efforts for each country to increase its soft power in the presence of its failure, and people don't believe it. So it doesn't really work. Instead of that, if you had the major leaders calling an emergency summit and saying, let's do something particularly to make sure we don't have a reservoir of COVID in the poor half of the globe, that would be a real change. I haven't seen any indication of a willingness to do this. On the second question about international organizations and the UN has lots of problems. We know all about them, but it's still the only significant universal organization that we have. And it's also true that the basic norms of the UN remain crucial, that you can't go to war, you can't take your neighbor's territory by force. This is sometimes violated, but we need to reaffirm those norms because that's the basis for a stable world order. In addition to that, we have organizations under the UN, like the World Trade Organization or the World Health Organization, which again are not perfect. Trump has criticized the WHO. But remember that the WHO is guided by its member countries. It's not as though the WHO is given a lot of authority for its countries. Instead of doing what Trump is doing, which is to withhold American funding to the WHO, we ought to be asking, how can we strengthen the WHO? And there are a variety of interesting proposals for doing that. And instead, what we see again is this zero-sum mentality of our leadership, which is missing an opportunity. And I think in that sense, yes, international organizations and institutions have their flaws, but the right response is to try to improve them and to supplement them with effective network organizations, not to undercut them.
Thank you. I found another group of questions which is about religion. You know, some people ask about morality and connection between morality and religion and politics, the role of Catholic Church or Orthodox Church, that kind of question. Could you elaborate on that, please?
Well, religion is a major source of morality for many people. But of course, there are different religions, and going back to my comment that just as different cultures will interpret the moral impulse in different ways, so do different religions interpret moral dictums in different ways. What's interesting is when you find commonalities across religions. The principle of do no harm is common across a number of religions. The principle, we sometimes in Christianity call it the golden rule: do unto others as you would have others do unto them. You also find the principle of not killing innocent women and children, which cuts across Islam and Buddhism and Christianity. So there are some commonalities among religions, but there are also very great differences. And the great dangers, indeed some of the greatest immoralities in human history, if when people have said, my religion is the only answer, And if you don't accept it, I will force you to accept it. So I will kill you to save your soul. And alas, there's been too much of that throughout history. Massacres, Protestants by Catholics and Catholics by Protestants, of Muslims by Christians, and vice versa. Even today in Myanmar, you find Buddhists, who are supposed to be the most pacific and peace-loving of people, taking part in persecutions of Rohingya minority Muslims. So no religion is perfect. Indeed, I would argue the danger is when people forget to combine religion with tolerance. Religion can be a great source of moral impulse, a very positive source. It can also be a great source of evil if people forget tolerance and think that they have the only truth and that they can impose it upon others.
Right. Thank you very much. There is an interesting question coming from our students. I cannot lose this opportunity. Paulina Butko. Paulina, are you here? Could you ask your question, please?
Yes, thank you, Professor Nye, for such a great opportunity to ask questions. And I was wondering, where would you put President Putin, in which category of your three categories on the scale in your book, which we just discussed?
Well, I don't know as much about President Putin as I know about the American president. So you'll have to adapt my judgments to your knowledge and how you see it. But President Putin, from what I see and have read about him from a distance, tends to see Russian national interest in a relatively narrow sense, without a broader sense of thinking in terms of the interests of others as well. And so I think in many cases, he has seen Russia first, if I can use Donald Trump's terms. He could have a little red hat that says, make Russia great again, just like Xi Jinping could have a little red hat saying, make China great again. And the two of them could stand next to each other with Donald Trump, and they would look identical in the way they were dressed. And I would say they would be quite similar in the way they behave. But I may be wrong. You'll have to make the rest of the judgment for yourself.
Thank you. Larissa Panina wants to ask a very theoretical question. Larissa, are you here? Oh. It looks that she is not here. Well, let's go to somebody else. Yasmina Kuwek. Hello. Well, anyway, I'll read the question because it's here. Dear Professor Nye, thank you for your presentation. My question is, in your opinion or experience as a professor, it's a professional question, what is more important in your presentations and teaching process, like citations, ethics, or morals?
Well, in writing, it is morally important to be fair in your citations. In other words, that if we're trying to substantiate an argument, we want to get the facts as clearly as we can. And if some other scholar has identified the facts or published them, then we have a moral obligation to cite properly or properly. The hard part comes when you're doing an academic book. You can do the citations, and I hope when you look at my book, you'll see that those citations are there. When you're giving a lecture, you can't stop all the time and say, as so-and-so said. And when you're writing an op-ed or a policy piece, which is only 700 or 800 words long, they don't accept citations. So you essentially wind up using other people's ideas. But one should try to be as open and honest as one can to give credit where credit is due as a moral obligation when you're trying to substantiate your case. And I hope that that's what I've done in the book.
Oh, thank you. Marat Galimov from Volgograd State University wants to ask a question. Volgograd is former Stalingrad, by the way.
Right, yep.
Marat.
As you keep on mentioning, but yes. Thank you, Professor Nye. I was wondering if there is such a thing, because I just learned the term, bipartisan foreign policy, and is it really connected to the good, from the moral point of view, presidents? I mean, when you have the best moral president of all, is there any bipartisan foreign policy decisions? Are they connected? Thank you.
Well, there are some bipartisan foreign policy decisions. They're not always moral ones or good ones. For example, you could see the Congress passed a support for President Bush, George W. Bush, in 2003. There's a congressional resolution of support for the invasion of Iraq. I would argue that that was bipartisan, but not moral. Or the policy didn't turn out to be moral for the reasons I discussed earlier. And there's some situations where you may have a bipartisan agreement, but where a policy then turns out to have some unexpected immoral consequences. In December 1992, the first President Bush sent US Marines to enforce the distribution of food to starving people in Somalia. But eventually that turned out that warlords were hijacking the food for political purposes. And when we tried to interfere with that, or when the UN tried to interfere with it, it led to fighting with the warlords, which eventually led to the withdrawal of the Marines under President Clinton. I think you had a bipartisanship going in with moral intentions, but not enough care in the assessment of potential unintended consequences. So some bipartisan steps can be immoral, but others can be moral. When the United States Congress declared war on Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor, that was an overwhelmingly bipartisan position, and I would argue a moral one.
Well, thank you. It's almost 1.5 hours, so I'm afraid that we should let you have a rest. But maybe we have you can take 2 or 3 more questions and.
Okay, let's aim then for another 5 minutes. But my wife is telling me it's time for lunch.
Yes. Okay, that's important. So Alexei Nikitin wants to ask a question about morality in the United States. Alexei, are you here? Hello?
Could you tell me his surname, please?
Nikitin. Well, I can read it then because it's interesting anyway. So it says, "Dear Professor Nye, thank you for your lecture."
I've turned the sound on. Sorry.
I'm here.
Are you here? Okay, go ahead with your question.
Dear Professor Nye, thank you for your lecture. I have a question about the Pentagon Papers. And what do you think is more moral, to publish secret documents so that people know the truth, or try to prohibit it, as did President Nixon, worrying about soldiers on the battlefield? Thank you.
Well, with the Pentagon Papers and others, there have been situations where a so-called whistleblower has violated secrecy laws. But I think what they have felt is that in terms of their own conscience, it was so important to alert the people in a democracy to the larger situation that this was justified. I tend to agree with that. And in the United States, Congress has passed what they call whistleblower laws, so that if somebody has a situation where they feel their conscience requires them to disclose something, even though it violates an oath of office, they can plead for immunity under the Whistleblower Act if they follow certain procedures. So I tend to the view that it's better to have these things out in the open.
Thank you.
Well, we have a question. I think it's the last question from Igor Yeremiev. I don't know. Can you find him?
I will try to.
It's in Russian. Igor Yeremiev. Otherwise, I'm going to read it.
I've turned it on.
All right. Thank you. Okay. Thank you, dear Professor Nye, for your very informative lecture. And I would like to ask you a question related to a widely discussed topic in information space right now, namely the turmoil in North Korea and Kim Jong-un. How can this, in your opinion, affect the United States and international policy and the conditions in the international community in general?
Well, I wish I knew the answer, because as far as I can tell, nobody knows what's really going on. There's some reports that Kim is desperately ill, that his train has been parked at a certain place for a long time. There are others who say, no, all this is wrong. The North Koreans have denied it. So we don't know. What we do know is that Kim Jong-un is trying to use his nuclear capability for coercive purposes, and that Trump thought that he could negotiate with him on a personal basis, but without any great success. So there was a stalemate that was in place, and that stalemate now seems to be pending what we learn about the health of Kim Jong-un, and also what happens in the American election in November. Predicting how this will turn out is extremely difficult. My hunch, and it's simply that, which is that you will probably wind up with a situation where the states in the region, which include the six powers that have been involved in the past, it's Russia, China, so forth, will try to contain the North Korean nuclear program to avoid its destabilizing effects. But whether that will still be possible after if there's a change in the leadership, is beyond my ability to predict.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Nye. We were delighted to have you and to listen to your wise opinions. And we are going to think about it and, maybe come out with some better thoughts. It was, of course, very, very important for our students also, and not only for our students, but we had people from many Russian universities and also some people from other countries. So I hope that we can see you in person sometime when the situation normalizes.
I will look forward to another visit to Moscow, which I've always enjoyed. And I thank you all for your attention, and be interested. It was very interesting to me to see the reactions to the book. So thank you very much.
Okay, we are going to read your book.
Yeah.
And as you saw, some people are already reading it.
Ahead of the game, yeah.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.